On April 5th, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt signed a document that required every American to hand over their gold. Not donate it, not loan it. Hand it over at a price the government had already decided, $20.67 per troy ounce. The penalty for refusing was a $10,000 fine, 10 years in federal prison, or both. No vote was taken. No debate in the Senate. Roosevelt used a wartime statute from 1917, the Trading with the Enemy Act, a law written to stop Americans from doing business with Germany during the First World War. In 1933, there was no war. The enemy, as the administration defined it, was the American citizen holding gold in a safe, a sock drawer, or a coffee can buried in the yard. The order was called Executive Order 6102. Its stated purpose was to combat hoarding. The actual purpose was something more precise. To understand what happened, you have to understand what gold meant in 1933. The United States was on the gold standard. Every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by a fixed quantity of gold. The Federal Reserve, by law, had to hold gold reserves equal to at least 40% of all currency it issued. By early 1933, after 3 years of Depression bank runs, those reserves were dangerously thin. Americans who had lost faith in banks were pulling their money out and converting it to gold. Every ounce of gold that moved into private hands was one less ounce the Federal Reserve could use to issue currency. The government needed that gold, not to protect it, to use it. The mechanics of what followed are worth laying out precisely. Citizens were required to bring their gold to Federal Reserve banks by May 1st, 1933. They were paid $20.67 per ounce in paper currency. They had no legal option to refuse. The exemptions were narrow, up to $100 in gold coins per person, gold used in industry or dentistry, and coins with recognized collector value. Everything else had to go. One man tested the order. Frederick Barber Campbell, a New York attorney, had deposited over 5,000 troy ounces at Chase National Bank. When he attempted to withdraw it after the order took effect, Chase refused. Campbell sued the bank. Federal prosecutors indicted him the following day for failing to surrender his gold. The prosecution ultimately failed on a technicality. The order had been signed by the president rather than the Secretary of the Treasury, as the underlying statute required. But the government's authority to take the gold was upheld by the court. Campbell's 5,000 ounces stayed with the Treasury. The message was clear. The law could be imperfect and still be enforced. Across the country, Americans complied. Some did not. There is no reliable count of how much gold was hidden rather than surrendered. Midnight gardening, people called it, burying coins and bars in backyards and basements. The government knew it was happening and did not pursue most cases aggressively. What mattered was the bulk of it, the volume, the tonnage. Then, 9 months after the order, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The act raised the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per troy ounce. Every ounce the government had collected from its citizens, paid out at $20.67, was now officially worth $35. The resulting profit to the federal government was approximately $2.8 billion. The people who had surrendered their gold received nothing when the price changed. They had already been paid. The transaction was complete. Their loss was permanent. In practical terms, Americans who complied with Executive Order 6102 had sold their gold at roughly 60% of what it would be worth 11 months later. They were not informed this was coming. There was no mechanism by which they could have been compensated after the fact. The government had needed a higher gold price to devalue the dollar and expand the money supply. It had acquired the gold first, then raised the price. The sequence was not accidental. The profit, $2.8 billion, was used to fund the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a treasury mechanism established by the same Gold Reserve Act. The fund was designed to manage the value of the dollar in international markets. Its operations have never required congressional approval. Its decisions have always been made by the Secretary of the Treasury with the consent of the President without a public vote. It still exists today. The $2.8 billion in 1934 dollars would be worth roughly $50 billion now. The government now had more gold than it had ever held. It needed somewhere to put it. In June 1935, the Treasury Department announced plans to build a depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The location was chosen for specific, deliberate reasons. It sat in the interior of the country, far from any coastline. It was adjacent to a functioning army post with an established garrison. The Appalachian Mountains lay to the east, a natural barrier against any force approaching from the Atlantic. And the Army's only fully mechanized cavalry unit was already stationed at Fort Knox, ready to be deployed in its defense. Construction began in 1935 and was completed in December 1936 at a cost of $560,000, the equivalent of roughly $9 million today. The building consumed 16,000 cubic feet of granite, 4,200 cubic yards of concrete, 750 tons of reinforced steel, and 670 tons of structural steel. The vault door was 21 inches thick and weighed 20 tons. It was set on a 100-hour time lock. No single staff member was given the entire combination. It required multiple people dialing separate sequences to open. In January 1937, the gold began arriving. The transportation operation was unprecedented. The Treasury used the United States Post Office to move the shipments, not the Army, not private contractors, but the Postal Service, because it was the only agency that would accept liability if any gold went missing. Postal workers rode in armored rail cars alongside soldiers, Secret Service agents, and mint guards. Decoy trains ran parallel routes on different tracks. At the railheads, Army trucks with machine gun escorts moved the bars to the vault. The first wave of shipments, completed by June 1937, moved 157 million troy ounces, nearly 4,900 metric tons, into the new depository. At its peak, in December 1941, Fort Knox held 649 million troy ounces of gold, the largest single accumulation of gold in one place in the history of the world. It had been taken from American citizens at $20.67 an ounce. Fort Knox became, in the national imagination, a symbol of absolute security. Movies were written about it. The phrase entered the language. The gold was assumed to be there, assumed to be exactly what the government said it was, in exactly the quantity the government claimed. That assumption has never been formally tested by anyone outside the Treasury's own structure. In 1953, the last full external audit of the Fort Knox depository took place. Since then, no independent verification of the gold's existence, quantity, or purity has been conducted by any party outside the Treasury apparatus. In 1974, after a conspiracy theory began circulating, promoted by a political activist named Peter Beater, that the vaults had been secretly emptied, Congress organized a limited inspection. A group of members and journalists were escorted into the facility. They saw gold bars. No count was conducted. No independent assay of the metal was performed. The bars they saw represented an unknown fraction of what the depository was said to hold. In 2017, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin visited Fort Knox. He was the first Treasury Secretary to enter the depository since John Wesley Snyder in 1948, a gap of 69 years. Mnuchin posted on social media that the gold was there. That was the extent of the public accounting. The Treasury's Inspector General has stated that continuous internal audits have been conducted since the early 1990s under the Chief Financial Officers Act. These are internal audits. The sampling methodology, the verification procedures, and the complete results are not published in a form that allows independent scrutiny. The word of the auditor and the word of the institution being audited belong to the same department. There is one final detail worth noting. The gold held at Fort Knox is recorded on the Treasury's books at $42.22 per troy ounce. That is the administrative book value set in 1973 and unchanged since. At current market prices, above $4,700 per ounce as of 2026, the gold in Fort Knox is worth something closer to $700 billion. The book value and the market value differ by a factor of more than 100. No legislation requires the book value to be updated. No audit requires the market value to be acknowledged. The largest gold reserve in the United States is carried on the government's balance sheet at a price last set when Richard Nixon was president and a gallon of gasoline cost 39 cents. On April 5th, 1933, Americans surrendered their gold at $20.67 an ounce under threat of a 10-year prison sentence. The government revalued it at $35 9 months later. It is now worth more than $4,700 an ounce. The vault where it sits has not been independently audited in over 70 years. The accounting entry that records its value has not been updated in over 50. The vault door weighs 20 tons. No single person knows its full combination. The gold, all 147 million troy ounces of it, sits in Kentucky, officially worth $42 an ounce, last verified by anyone outside the Treasury in 1974. That is the public record. Make of it what you will. The man who designed the order, Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, died in 1967. Roosevelt died in 1945. The architects of the policy that transferred the largest private gold holdings in American history into government hands are gone. The exchange stabilization fund they created with the proceeds still operates. The depository they built still stands. The book value they never updated is still on the ledger. The gold was taken legally. The accounting has never been reconciled. And the door, as it has been for nearly 90 years, remains closed.